We have 14 games, so we're going to dive right into it. Here is our player usage data tool, a part of the Awesemo College Football package. There's a lot of things we have: ownership projections, regular projections, this data, including slate write-ups, everything you need to dominate. But diving into the slate, we're starting off with a banger between Michigan State and Ohio State. Overall, this is a game that has a high total, 68.5. Ohio State is a 19-point favorite, but Michigan State projects to keep this close enough to be competitive. That makes Peyton Thorne viable at his price, $7K on DraftKings, somewhat mobile with 137 yards. Decent as a passer, averaging nearly 245 per game on just 27.5 attempts. And we've seen Michigan State pick up the pace and the pass rate since they started a Big Ten play. So Thorne is viable. He's harder to stack. You have Jalen Naylor out with a hand injury. Not expecting to see him, but watch his status pregame. That's put Jaden Reed into just a monster workload. He's had at least 10 targets per game since Naylor went down, and he's averaging 83 yards himself already. So Reed is in an excellent role. I think you could use him. The wide receiver 2 has been Trey Mosley for the most part. They will use Monterey Foster a bit there, but it has been somewhat of a rotation behind them. It was nice to see Mosley step up with the 7-target game. Foster still viable near the min. In the run game, Kenneth Walker, he's been an absolute monster, and he's taken on an increased pass role, which is positive. 2.3 targets per game in their last 4, but over 22 carries in each of the last 4 as well. 30 carries in the most recent contest, averaging 147 yards. Walker's always viable. On the Ohio State side, CJ Stroud, he's another player to look at in the expensive tier, 9,500, but he's almost a lock to get 300 yards passing per game. He's averaging 337, not mobile whatsoever, but Ohio State very pass heavy, and they will play with some tempo. He's easy to stack too. They have 3 elite options: Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. There's not a lot separating their target volume, especially over the last 4 games. 9.3 for Olave, 9.7 for Wilson, 10.3 for Smith and Jigba. And the efficiency kind of mirrors that. Smith and Jigba is the most expensive. He already has 1,000 yards. Wilson slightly less expensive, 813, missed a game. And then you have Olave, 708, more of the possession receiver, but all 3 are stackable. The run game, Trevion Henderson, still expensive, 8,500. Split time a little more with Mayan Williams last week. The game against Purdue looked a little closer than maybe we think. 30 points, over 30 points allowed for Ohio State, but the game wasn't close even from the beginning. Mayan Williams, 13 carries, still over 90 yards rushing. In competitive games, we've seen a willingness for them to just hand him the rock, 28 and 21 carries prior. He's a very, very good play. Iowa State, Oklahoma, this game has a 59.5 total, a 3.5-point spread in favor of the Sooners, moving heavily in Iowa State's direction. Both teams a little slower this year, but both fairly pass-heavy. Iowa State, particularly in recent weeks, has really elevated their passing volume to the benefit of Brock Purdy, who's playing some of the best football of his career. Just numbers depressed by an early season reliance on the run, which they did not have success with. So Purdy now receiving extra volume, somewhat mobile himself with 273 yards. They're also using Jalen Noel a lot as the wide receiver 2 right now. He's somebody you can look to as a potential punt at 3,100. He has 14 combined targets over the last 2 games. In the run game, Breece Hall is starting to see less volume, still very active as a pass catcher, but they're just not having a lot of success running. So former All-American Breece Hall's volume is not quite where it was to begin the year. Still averaging 25 touches per game, 115 yards rushing, and another 25 through the air. But 9,400 is quite a bit to pay for Hall in this spot. On the other side, Caleb Williams, he got banged up in their last game. Rattler came in, but it looks like Williams is going to give it a go. Very mobile, 307 yards on the ground, averaging 190 per game through the air. That's just limited based on timeshare with Rattler to start the year. But it's a tough matchup against Iowa State's defense. Williams, again, he struggled really against Baylor in his first tough matchup of the year. So how does he look here? You're just dealing with a very volatile asset, and he's really expensive. So I'd rather play Stroud or some of the other expensive guys. In the run game, Kennedy Brooks is still outpacing Eric Gray, and it's not close. In better matchups, Brooks is going to have better output. They got handled by Baylor last week. It's only 14 carries, but we've seen him above 20 plenty of times this year. Gray's not really a factor anymore. The receiving game is what it is. It's going to be a timeshare, even though Marvin Mims has just dwarfed all the receivers in efficiency. He's just not going to play more than 50% of the snaps, averaging 3 targets per game in their last 4, despite almost doubling the output of second leading receiver Jaden Hazelwood. It's egregious. I've been vocal about it. It's not changing. Marvin Mims is still too expensive for his role. Hazelwood is as well. He is a possession receiver, averaging 4.8 targets per game over their last 4. They'll rotate in Michael Woods, Mario Williams, Jeremiah Hall, Stogner, Drake Stoops, Braden Willis, Trayvon West. The list goes on. It's about an 8-man timeshare. Wake Forest taking on Clemson, A sneaky game overall, 57 total here. We know what Wake Forest has on defense, and it's nearly non-existent. So Clemson, can they take advantage of this? Wake Forest has been extremely up-tempo, very pass-heavy. They're 4.5-point underdogs here, and Clemson's played fairly solid defense, but Sam Hartman's been an absolutely elite quarterback this year. 10-3 is a ton to pay for him in a somewhat depressed game environment, but I still prefer the over in this game. He's a good rusher, 329 yards on the ground, averaging nearly 320 passing yards per game on 35 attempts. Hartman just backdoors his way into a lot of 300 games on the backs of A.T. Perry and Jacare Roberson. Roberson got banged up in their last game. I haven't seen a lot on his status. Right now, tentatively expecting him to play, but just make sure Roberson's out there. That would be big for the offense, and you could stack Hartman with either. The only concern is that stack is getting more and more expensive. You could also throw Taylor Morin in there as the wide receiver 3. He has 11 targets combined over their last 2 games. In the run game, Christian Beal-Smith, he was in a boot, so it looks like this could hold him out for a couple extra weeks. We don't know, so watch Christian Beal-Smith pregame, but Justice Ellison worked as the 1A to Christian Turner as the 1B. Again, they're underdogs, tough Clemson run defense, but neither is expensive, so Ellison and Turner, viable GPP plays. On the Clemson side, DJ Uiagalelei, he should be the starter still. Mobile with 241 rushing yards, but he's a bigger bodied guy. Not very active as a passer, and Clemson, their best matchup comes on the ground. So while they are passing the ball at a high rate, nearly 51% of the time, I think they embrace the run here against Wake Forest, and they don't need to use Uiagalelei, who's been nothing more than a game manager. That should help Will Shipley. He and Kobe Pace missed the game against UConn just out of precaution. Coaching staff came out after the game and said they were both available, but neither played. Didn't matter against UConn. So Will Shipley, 6,700. He could potentially handle a workhorse role. He got banged up in the game prior. That's why his carry count was at 14. But when healthy, we've seen him over 20 carries plenty of times. It looks like Clemson's run game's getting healthier, so Shipley would be in play for tournaments. You should have Kobe Pace back, but Phil Maffa, Rencher, those are change of pace guys. Their receiving core is extremely banged up. We are now dealing with injuries to Justin Ross, Joseph Nada, Braden Galloway, Frank Ladson, none of whom are going to play, which means your top 2 receivers at this point are going to be Dakari Collins and Bo Collins. They should be the 1-2, neither of whom is expensive. Dakari Collins, 12 targets last game, Bo Collins, 10. They're cheap enough, like that's flat out just where I'm looking. Davis Allen at tight end, and EJ Williams is the wide receiver 3. I don't expect them to throw a lot, but if you're just looking for cheap volume, Clemson certainly has it. Purdue taking on Northwestern, a 48.5-point total, which surprised me as bad as Northwestern's defense has been and how good Purdue is on offense, passing 61.5% of the time, running 78 plays. Aiden O'Connell is a significant liability on the ground, negative 105 rushing yards coming mainly from sacks, but he backdoors his way into a lot of 300-yard games, averaging 275 on 36 attempts, and Northwestern hasn't shown any life on defense whatsoever. However, a lot of teams just run on Northwestern. They're allowing over 250 yards per game, making King Doru and Xander Horvath intriguing plays. Their volume has been depressed in recent weeks based on tough matchups, but even 3 weeks ago, we saw 17 carries for Doru, 11 for Horvath, and that's kind of been the split, the distribution. It's like a 60-40 share between the two. I think you could look to them in tournaments against a really bad Northwestern run defense. Otherwise, David Bell's the pure alpha receiver. He's averaging 14.3 targets per game and 122 yards. It's just a ridiculous role for Bell. He's still too cheap. Milton Wright and Jackson Anthrop are the wide receiver 2, the wide receiver 3. They use Payne Durham as the tight end, and occasionally you'll see TJ Sheffield, Brock Thompson rotate onto the field. But if you're playing these guys, I think you want to just get down to the Milton Wrights and the Jackson Anthrops. Right below 4K is still a really good price for a guy averaging 6.5 targets per game over the last 4 and 6 targets on the year. Northwestern is going to be splitting time 50-50 between Ryan Helinski and Andrew Marty. You're not playing any of them. The running backs, the timeshare between Evan Hall and Andrew Clare. Purdue's been pretty good on defense. The receivers, maybe you backdoor your way into some volume with the Stephon Robinson, 7.3 targets per game over the last 3, or Malik Washington, 6 targets per game over the last 4. Really tough to get to anyone on Northwestern overall with their 19-point implied team total. If anything, they're just run backs to stacks. Florida State, Boston College, 1.5-point spread in favor of Boston College, 54.5 total. Another place I like the over, and we'll get to that. But Florida State, they've actually shown life on offense of late. They're not playing with much pace or high pass volume. That's because Jordan Travis is their quarterback, and he's very, very mobile. But there's a lot to like about Florida State's offense right now. Again, Jordan Travis, 402 rushing yards on the year. That's the best matchup here against Boston College, who's very good against pass, but they're allowing 184 rushing yards per game, which Travis exploits. From there, you have Jayshon Corbin, Trayshawn Ward in a timeshare, and Lawrence Toafili, who's been banged up, but he'll siphon a few carries here and there when healthy. He was listed as probable for this game, but Corbin's the most efficient. I think you just play him if you're getting one of these guys, but Travis can exploit this matchup too. In the receiving game, you're not really playing anybody for a pass, I guess I should say a run-heavy Florida State team, a pass-devoid Florida State team. But Andrew Parchment's been the wide receiver one. From there, like Keyshawn Helton missed their most recent game. He should be back. Ontario Wilson's been consistent. Just don't play a lot of Florida State pass catchers unless you're stacking the game. On the other side, Boston College has been much faster, much pass heavier since the return of Phil Yurkovich, which nobody really expected. But Yurkovich is mobile, 197 yards on the ground this year. He's averaging 186 pass yards per game on just 15 attempts. The guy is extremely efficient. So he takes advantage of a Florida State pass defense, which has struggled particularly in recent weeks, allowing 300 yards or more in back-to-back games. Yurkovich is a cheap guy worth targeting. He's at the minimum. Again, this is just a flat-out mispricing here and egregious oversight by DraftKings. I don't think he's hurt. And again, I double-checked this, but perhaps I'm missing something. If I am, leave it in the comment section. But I'm pretty sure Yurkovich is going to start this game. Now, in the running backfield, Pat Garwo, he's handled a larger opportunity of late. He's out-carried Alex Sinkfield 30-9 and 24-4 over the last two games. He's clearly working ahead of Sinkfield at this point. You can also take advantage of Florida State on the ground too. So Garwo is interesting. He's just not active in the pass game at all. So if this gets out of hand and Florida State here is the favorite, then, Boston College is only a slight favorite, then it's tough to trust Garwo if they get behind. At receiver, Zay Flowers is the alpha. Jaden Williams is the 2. Trey Berry is their tight end. And then Jalen Gill's their clear wide receiver 3 now with CJ Lewis hurt. So these are the top 3 pass catchers. Zay Flowers averages 8.3 targets per game over their last 4. So he's the preferred option, but he's expensive. Jaden Williams and Trey Berry and Jalen Gill are all really cheap here. So they're also cheap stacking options here. Trey Berry, before he got hurt, he was pretty clearly the second pass catcher on the team to get to, but now his volume's been a little bit down. It's risky, but I think you can play Berry. Williams, I would have interest in too. Rutgers, Penn State, 46.5 total. A really interesting game to get to here. Rutgers and Penn State both play fast. Penn State's really pass heavy. Rutgers, they are not. That is because they rely on the dual threat ability of Noah Vidral, who's been banged up a ton of late, but 254 rushing yards, only averaging 158 through the air. He's just middling in both phases, and Penn State plays solid enough defense where I don't want to target Rutgers, implied for just 14.75 points. That stems to the backfield where you have Pacheco splitting time with Monangai and Aaron Young. Not a great situation in the among running backs. And then at receiver, it's Bo Melton and Shameen Jones with Aaron Cruikshank hurt. There's not a lot behind them, but Bo Melton's averaging 9 targets per game over the last 4. Shameen Jones is at 5 targets per game in that span. There could be some cheap volume here, but again, really low total game, low implied team total for Rutgers. On Penn State, efficiency definitely sides with Clifford. He's averaging nearly 260 yards per game on 35.5 attempts, and this matchup suits him. Rutgers has not been good in pass defense. He's mobile with 137 yards. It's just a matter of, does Penn State take their foot off the gas? And last week, we saw Kevon Lee with 20 carries. Noah Cain didn't carry the ball. John Lovett, 4 carries. Lovett's been horribly inefficient, so it wasn't a surprise to see him phased out. But Noah Cain returns. Does this backfield become a 3-man committee again? But Kevon Lee is somewhat viable here as just a punt play in the run game. It's not my favorite spot to target, but again, you're not paying anything for him. Rutgers allows over 150 rushing yards per game. So there are reasons, I think, to take a look at this. Otherwise, Jahan Dotson is the pure alpha receiver. The only real concern at this point is, do they take their foot off the gas? Dotson's averaging nearly 15 targets per game over their last 4 contests. So just crazy involvement for Dotson. Behind him, we know who's going to get the ball. It is going to be Parker Washington is the 2. Keandre Lambert-Smith is the 3. I think you can play them at cheaper prices. Lambert-Smith, 3.6K. He's live too. Texas taking on West Virginia, 56.5 point total. 2 teams playing a little slower than expected, but West Virginia very pass heavy. Texas very run heavy, which looks like it's going to be an issue here with Bijan Robinson out for the season, dislocated elbow. But Casey Thompson, He's the starter. They platooned him with Hudson Card last week, but Card turned the ball over twice and very little play volume, so he's out. Casey Thompson's the starter, somewhat mobile, somewhat efficient, just volume doesn't project to be on his side. From there, you're going to see Roschon Johnson as the lead back now, former quarterback. Keelan Robinson's been hurt. If he can return, he'll help ease the loss of Bijan. They already lost Gabriel Watson. Like Jonathan Brooks might play a role, but I'm fully expecting Roschon to be the lead back here, and he's cheap at 3,800. So Roschon is the guy to target, in my opinion. Former quarterback. I think he handles a majority of the work with just the injuries Texas has sustained at the running back position, but tough. This West Virginia defense is the strength of their team right now. Overall, I think maybe you'll see some timeshare, but not too much. In the receiving room, it's going to be tough to trust anybody, but Xavier Worthy has been a monster. 23 targets in their most recent game. Joshua Moore was banged up. They've been missing Jordan Whittington. He's the only option they really have, but he's very expensive at 7,200. I would rather just play like David Bell. Behind him, Marcus Washington's played more. Kelvontae Dixon's played more, but I really think you just want to target Roschon in this spot. Otherwise, you probably maybe look at Worthy in tournaments, and Marcus is very cheap, but 4,900 even is probably expensive for his role. On West Virginia, Garrett Green is back. That means you're going to see Deggy ceding some snaps to Green, who's like a dynamic spark plug in the run game for this team. And Deggy needs the volume. He needs the snaps because he's such a negative in the run game, so it's really tough to target him. Not to mention Texas, their strength on defense is against the pass. They're allowing nearly 205 rushing yards per game to opponents, which could give Letty Brown one of the few efficiency spots of the year. He's only averaging 74.5 rush yards per game on 21.5 touches, but their offensive line is so bad that they haven't been able to exploit a lot of matchups. We'll see if they can against Texas. In the receiving game, Isaiah Esdell's been hurt, but he's questionable for this spot. Sean Ryan's also questionable. That could consolidate opportunities to Winston Wright, Bryce Ford Wheaton, and Sam James. But you're just going to have to watch warmups to see how this shakes out. None of them are great price-adjusted plays. If I were taking any of them, it would probably be Sam James at his price, but tough to get to any of them. Illinois, Iowa. This is the worst game on the board, a 37.5 total, so we won't spend a lot of time on this. Two slow teams, two run-heavy teams. Chase Brown is the only option for Illinois. 32 carries in their last game. He's averaging over 100 yards per game on 19.5 touches. Iowa plays great run defense, so he's just a contrarian play. Nobody in the receiving room is viable. The quarterbacks aren't either. Same thing for Iowa. Petrus is going to be back, it looks like, but he's such a negative in the run game that he needs elevated pass volume to overcome this, which he never gets. He's averaging 158 yards through the air. I think Keegan Johnson's somewhat viable as a tournament play at 3,700, with the total so low that you don't want to get to this. Ivory Kelly Martin's been out, which has forced them to use more Tyler Goodson, who's been one of the least efficient backs in the country, but that's not all his fault. 4 new starting linemen here. Goodson can catch, so he's a volume-based GPP play, and that's all there is in this game, just the running backs. Georgia Tech, Notre Dame. This game has a 58.5 point total, 17-point spread in favor of the Irish, giving them a massive implied team total. Both of these teams are a little bit above average in terms of pace, and Notre Dame, they've embraced the pass more than Georgia Tech. But Jeff Sims is hurt. It doesn't look like he's going to play, which makes Jordan Yates the starter. Not a huge downgrade, just not as efficient as a passer, but both these guys are mobile, and it's a decent matchup with a high total. I still think I would look elsewhere in this spot. Jahmyr Gibbs is the lead back. He will cede a little bit of work to Jordan Mason, Dante Smith, but overall, Jahmyr Gibbs is the leader, and he's phenomenal in the pass game, averaging 4.2 targets per game and nearly 50 yards receiving per game. He has almost 500 receiving yards. He actually leads the team in receiving. So Jahmyr Gibbs is a fairly solid GPP play based on his pass game role. In the receiving game, Kyrick McGowan is the target leader. He's narrowly behind Malachi Carter in terms of receiving yardage. And then you have Adonica Sanders functioning as the wide receiver 3. That is the order I prefer them. And I think Malachi Carter, he's the best play based on price at 4,700. For Notre Dame, Jack Cohn, it's the same thing that we've seen with like West Virginia, where he does all the passing and then Buckner comes in for these gadget run plays, which is difficult to trust. But Notre Dame has a massive total. Still not trying to stack Cohn, but if you look at the pass catchers, Michael Mayer's the best option, 5,600. He's consistent. Kevin Austin has now stepped up as a wide receiver 1 with Avery Davis out for the year. Lindsey has to be the 2, and they've used Lorenzo Styles as the wide receiver 3. I mean, Styles is really cheap, but I think there's better volume plays in the sub 4K range. Mayer's the guy I would try to get to. But ultimately, Kyron's still the best play in this offense, in my opinion. He's averaging 86 yards per game, over 21 touches. Kyron has a phenomenal role in the pass game. He's averaging 31 yards per game through the air. In Georgia Tech's defense, they allow almost 180 rush yards per game. Georgia Tech has been a sieve on defense. Kyron will split some time with Logan Diggs and Chris Tyree, which is a concern, but in tournaments, I'm still fine with it. Arkansas taking on Bama, one of the better real-life games, 58-point total, making it middling for DFS. Arkansas implied below 20 points at 18.5. They're fast, but they're run-heavy. That's because KJ Jefferson is a primary dual-threat signal caller. 474 yards on the ground for him, just shy of 200 through the air, but they're not a high-volume passing attack. They have been at times, and maybe they will have to be here. Game scripts definitely suggest that. And when they do so, Treylon Burks is the alpha receiver. He's a 31% target share, just not a ton of efficiency there, 78 yards per game. Most of that comes from their high run rates. The wide receiver 2 is Tyson Morris based on volume and routes, but he actually has one less target than Warren Thompson. It's basically Treylon Burks at 71 targets, and then their second most targeted receiver at 29. So behind Burks, it's kind of a barren wasteland. The backfield has become a timeshare as well. You saw Traylon Smith lead the backfield to start the year, but recently it's become the Dominique Sanders show. He's minimum price on DraftKings, and clearly it's a difficult matchup. Alabama only allowing 85 yards per game, but stone minimum. I mean, pricing is really inefficient this week. There's a lot of cheap backs and a larger workload. On the Alabama side, Bryce Young, he's very similar to like a CJ Stroud, where he's not the most mobile, but pure volume and efficiency propels him to 300 yards more times than not. 9,800 is an expensive price, and I would still probably prefer Stroud, but Bryce Young certainly live. He was a dual threat coming out of high school, so it's interesting that he's not running, but that's a concern. In the run game, Brian Robinson will handle a feature back workload when they're in competitive games. We haven't seen that of late, and this does not project to be that competitive here, but perhaps Robinson handles more. With the timeshare, you see a lot of Trey Sanders recently. Demoy Kennedy has played more. That's basically because of attrition. They lost a couple guys in McClellan early in the year. Roy Dell's out for the year now, so they don't really have a lot of backups, which makes Trey Sanders somewhat interesting in tournaments, and Brian probably too expensive at $9K, but in the right matchup, you could use him. Receivers, John Mechie and Jamison Williams just aren't targeted as much as some other guys on the slate, like the Ohio State receivers, but the efficiency's been there, particularly for Williams, who averages over 100 yards per game with just 7.4 targets. Mechie's right behind him, 72 yards per game and 8.5 targets, more of a possession-style receiver. And then they don't use a clear wide receiver 3. Bolden is the 3 when healthy and when they're not using 2 tight ends. They do that a lot with Cameron Latou and Jaleel Billingsley. Trayshawn Holden's actually played a little more as well. So it's tough to target any of these ancillary options for Bama. It's basically Williams, Mechie, and then you're throwing darts on Bolden, Latou, and Billingsley. SMU Cincinnati, one of the better matchups, I guess I should say more difficult matchups for Cincinnati this year. An interesting opponent, like a high-flying offense. Cincinnati hasn't really faced one of those. But their defense has definitely struggled a little more than we may have expected, and Cincinnati's played a lot of close games. With that said, the spread is still 10.5 here, 65-point total, so we're expecting some points. SMU, very fast, very pass-heavy, and their implied team total is still 27, so they're going to put up some points here too, nearly 4 scores. The coaching staff lied to us last week saying Preston Stone was going to play. He only saw a couple of snaps when the game was out of hand. Tanner Mordecai is still handling them all, and it looks like Mordecai probably does so here in a make-or-break game for SMU. Mordecai is mobile, 191 yards on the ground, averaging 326 through the air. The volume is just so high for him in this high-powered offense. Mordecai backdoors his way to 300 a lot. He projects close to it, even in a tough matchup against Cincinnati here. Easy to stack, too. The only issue is Danny Gray is hurt. We'll have to see if he plays in this game. I wouldn't say it's looking positive, but they also don't have Jordan Curley, which means Rashee Rice should be the wide receiver 1. Reggie Roberson becomes the 2. And then Roderick Daniel stepped up as the wide receiver 3 with 7 targets. Another guy who's at the stone minimum. So again, salary not really an issue on this week's slate. Grant Calcaterra is a tight end who averages 7.3 targets per game over their last 4 contests, and he's 4.1K. A lot of cheap volume for SMU. In the run game, Ulysses Bentley actually came back and played a role. We had no idea when this would happen because they'd been so coy with his injury status, but it looks like he's back. He should outcarry Siggers slightly. It's going to be like a 60-40 timeshare, 70-30 timeshare in favor of Bentley, which again points to him as the better play, as nearly you get basically a 2K discount going to Bentley, but still a tough matchup. For Cincinnati, really high total again, nearly 40 points implied for their team. Ritter's mobile. Ritter does not have the volume, but he has efficiency. Again, this is a spot where maybe SMU paces up Cincinnati, and Cincinnati can't take their foot off the gas like they have in a ton of games. So Ritter is viable in tournaments. He's also easier to stack. Alec Pierce in competitive games will see a higher target share, but he is just egregiously expensive. For 6.8 targets per game, you're telling me you're not just going to go down and pay for David Bell? So it's really hard to stack with him. I would rather play like a Leonard Taylor or Josh Wiley at tight end, but they run a nasty rotation behind Pierce. And in the backfield, Jerome Ford missed their last game, I think probably in preparation for this spot. I'm expecting him to return, and he's a bell cow when healthy. But without Ford, they use a three-way committee with Charles McClellan, Ethan Wright, and Ryan Montgomery. Tough to trust the situation, assuming if Ford misses the game. If Ford's back, I think he's in play. Michigan taking on Maryland, a 57.5-point total. Michigan, 14.5-point favorites. Michigan playing a little faster than normal, still extremely run-heavy. We know what Maryland's going to do. They're high-flying, pass-heavy offense, and they're very bad on defense. Michigan, they have good matchups across the board, but they're not going to use McNamara unless they have to. He's a game manager, so he's basically just tournaments only. In the run game, Blake Corum is expected to miss the rest of the regular season and hopefully be back for like a potential showdown at the end of the year if they are bowl eligible, which they will be, or if they make the postseason. So Blake Corum, we're not expecting to see him. Just keep your eye out there. Without Corum, Hassan Haskins handled an enormous workload, just absolutely monstrous workload. 5 targets, 31 carries. Haskins is still too cheap at this price against a Maryland defense allowing 164 rushing yards per game. In the receiving game, you need volume for these guys to get there, and they just don't project to see it in these matchups where they're significant favorites. Cornelius Johnson leads the team in targets and yards, but Eric All came back from injury. He's been averaging 6.7 targets per game over their last 3. Roman Wilson popped up for 7 targets. Mike St. Reed still's on the field, but just not viable unless they get down in games. For Maryland, dealing with so many injuries at this point, Talia backdoors his way to 300 yards quite often. It's going to be difficult against a strong Michigan pass rush and defensive backfield here, and his negative rushing output is concerning. But Talia, the volume's there in the pass game. He averages nearly 309 yards per game. For running backs, they lost Shalin Famato, but they still use the 3-way committee with Fleet Davis, Penny Boone, and Colby McDonald. Not viable. The receiving game, Raheem Jarrett finally saw the volume we were expecting for him once they lost Dante Demas and Jay Sean Jones. They also lost Marcus Fleming last week, making Raheem Jarrett their clear alpha. They've used Chigo Okonkwo a lot more, too. He has target counts of 15 and 19 in back-to-back games. Carlos Carriere is their de facto wide receiver, 2 at this point. They just don't have anybody else. And they split time with Darryl Jones and Brian Cobbs as a wide receiver 3. Jarrett is still too cheap. Carriere is the 2 now. He's somewhat viable. Nebraska taking on Wisconsin, another horrific game environment, 43-point total. Wisconsin 9-point favorites. Both teams really slow and run heavy. Martinez has seen much better matchups. He's a dual threat, 489 rushing yards, but Wisconsin's run defense is near the top of the country. He's been efficient as a passer too, but you just don't expect the same efficiency from Martinez here. Ramir Johnson's been the only back they've been using of late. They didn't use Yant last week, but again, really tough matchup for Ramir. Tournament play based on volume. In the receiving game, if you're stacking for whatever reason, which I would not because they run so many different receivers, it's Torrey or probably bust. Omar Manning does have 15 targets in their last 2 games, but we've seen this be a timeshare. We've seen the whimsical nature of Scott Frost put some guys on the field and then bench them the next week. We just have no idea who gets the volume. For Wisconsin, you can't target anyone in the pass game under game manager Graham Mertz. Their receivers don't see any volume either. If you were playing one, it's probably Danny Davis or Jake Ferguson at a cheap price, but I'm not touching them. Braylon Allen is the man in the backfield now because they lost Ches Malusi, Jalen Berger-Transfield, and they lost Garendo. So they still will use a timeshare to some degree, but Allen's the guy they will lean on. He now averages over 100 yards per game, and he's seen 20 carries in 2 of the last 3, which is positive for him. And he's also been targeted 1 time each, which is positive moving forward. But they use Brady Shipper. They use Julius Davis a little bit. They're just going to be changes of pace. And I think you can use Braylon Allen with some confidence. Last game on the DraftKings main slate, it is perhaps the best one to target if the injuries shake out in a positive way. Virginia taking on Pittsburgh, a 66-point total, 14.5-point spread in favor of Pitt. The big thing with Virginia is the status of Brennan Armstrong, who missed their last game, and Jay Wolfark was just absolutely inept in his place. So Armstrong, if he plays, he's very mobile. He's very efficient. He averages nearly 400 passing yards per game on 45 attempts. Virginia just so pass-heavy, so much play volume here. Armstrong's always in play, and he increases the viability of everyone else in this game if he plays. Last week, they did not have Wayne Talapapa. We have no idea if he'll be back, but you probably don't want to play a Virginia running back anyway. None of them average over 9 touches per game. In the receiving core, Billy Kemp got banged up in their last game, so we saw his target volume drop. He not only has 9 targets combined in the last 2 games, he's just been banged up. Watch his status. He'll be key for this game. Without him, Keaton Thompson now has at least 10 targets in 3 straight games. He's active in the run game, where he's at least 3 carries in that span. He's a very, very strong play here. And Dontavian Wicks is somebody else you could look to if Billy Kemp is out. Little expensive if Kemp plays as the 3rd most targeted receiver, but he still leads the team in receiving yards, and he averages over 100 per game. Rashawn Henry would be the primary beneficiary with a Kemp absence. He's typically functioning as the wide receiver 4, but you obviously would see increased routes, snaps, targets, everything there. And then Jelani Woods is the tight end. But Rashawn Henry would be the primary beneficiary of Kemp, and he's another guy below 4K. For Pitt, Kenny Pickett, another extremely efficient quarterback, averaging 350 yards per game, somewhat mobile with 223 on the ground. Pitt's extremely fast and extremely pass-heavy, which makes this matchup so fun. He's certainly targetable at his price. Easy to stack to with Jordan Addison, who averages 10.5 targets per game and over 100 receiving yards. The wide receiver 2 now is Jared Wayne. That's because Taysier Mack is out, and he was seen in a sling last week, so we're still not expecting to see Taysier Mack, but just watch the status. Jared Wayne, extremely cheap stacking partner with Kenny Pickett here. The wide receiver 3 is Shockey Jacques Louis, but that'll rotate a little bit. Lucas Krull's the primary tight end, splits time up somewhat with Gavin Bartholomew, but still okay with Krull. But ultimately, Jared Wayne is such a strong price-adjusted receiver that you don't need to target some of these ancillary guys. In the running back field, Abanaconda, he's been leading the group here. He out-touched Vincent Davis and Rodney Hammond. Last week, 17 touches for Abanaconda, Vincent Davis just 6, and Rodney Hammond basically an afterthought, only 2 carries for him. So Abanaconda takes advantage of a matchup against Virginia. They're allowing 236 rushing yards per game, so certainly viable, based more on efficiency than volume here. But the FanDuel slate is here as well. You can take a look at this. We won't cover it just for the sake of saving some time, but it's all available to you. Otherwise, thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comment section who your favorite play is. Would love to hear it. I am Matt Gajewski on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Thanks again, guys, for watching. Good luck, and we'll see you again next time.